Well, nothing like dropping a microphone to get everyone's attention. So, welcome everyone. I really appreciate seeing so many faces out here tonight for what I'd say is a really important discussion that we need to be having in Metro Vancouver regarding the future of transportation. I'd first like to just acknowledge that we are here tonight on the unceded territory of the Cote First Nation and Cote Salish people. So welcome everyone here to the City of New Westminster and the Anvil Centre. Today is the last event of the day of a transportation forum, which has really been an engaging discussion about the future of transportation. I think for those that have been following transportation and might consider themselves a bit of a transportation geek, you're well aware that there's a number of things, whether it's autonomous vehicles, whether it's the rise of ride-hailing and car sharing, or the electrification of vehicles that have the potential to really disrupt our transportation systems. And this disruption could be very positive for our transportation systems, but it could also have some negativity. So tonight, I'm hoping to link and connect that discussion with another important discussion that we're having in the region regarding mobility pricing and how we fund transportation. Because how we fund transportation, whether we like it or not, is going to change in the future. The reliability of gas taxes is certainly not a certain thing, and most likely not going to be a reliable source into the future. So we need to start thinking a little bit differently about how we're funding and organizing our transportation system. So we're very lucky tonight to have an incredible group of panelists joining us here tonight to really talk about how all of these issues come together and really what the future of transportation is going to look like. I'm pretty excited to be sitting up on the same stage with the folks here. Before coming here this evening, my wife said, I know you're really excited about the panel, but please don't be a nerd and ask for their autographs or get too many selfies with them. So I'm pretty excited. I know a lot of these folks really don't need a lot of introduction, but I do want to read out their bios so everyone knows the backgrounds of the individuals that we have here today. First, we have Robin Chase, and Robin Chase is a transportation entrepreneur. She is the founder and former CEO of Zipcar, the largest car-sharing company in the world. She's also involved with BuzzCar, a service that brings car owners and drivers in a car-sharing marketplace in France, and Go Loco, an online ride-sharing community. And we really had the pleasure to be able to spend the day with Robin today as she really engaged us in those discussions about really where innovation in the future of transportation is taking us. Next, we have Joy MacPhail. Joy MacPhail is the Vice Chair of the Independent Commission on Mobility Pricing and the Chair of the Insurance Corporation. Joy is a recovering politician, was an MLA first elected in 1991 and served until 2005. During that time, she served a number of really important portfolios, including Deputy Premier, Minister of Finance, Minister of Health, Minister of Education, Government House Leader, and Leader of Opposition. Next, we have Brent Toderian, who is an urbanist and owner and consultant of Toderian Urban Works. Brent Toderian is a nationally and internationally respected practitioner and thought leader with over 25 years of experience in advanced urbanism, city planning, and urban design. In recent years, he has advised and collaborated with cities and agencies both nationally and internationally. And last but certainly not least, we have Marc Lee, a senior economist with the Canadian Centre of Policy Alternatives. Marc Lee researches and writes on a variety of economic and social policy issues for the CCPA. And in addition to tracking federal and provincial budgets and economic trends, Marc has also published a wide range of topics from poverty to inequality to globalization. He is also the past former vice chair of the Vancouver Planning Commission. So if we could just give a round of applause for the great panelists that we have here tonight. Now, in a moment, I'm going to be joining these folks on these comfortable couches to really try and engage and inspire a really good dialogue about these issues. But although I'm going to be leading the discussions with some questions, we really want to give an opportunity for everyone in this room to be able to participate and engage in this discussion. So. I don't know if there's going to be instructions on the screen, but we are using something called Slido. And if we go to slido.com and put in pound mobility, everyone will have an opportunity to put their questions forward. We'll also have an opportunity to vote on each other's questions, and that's what we will use to determine which questions do get asked. For those of you who may not be able to connect with Slido or don't have a cell phone, you're also able to write your questions down and talk to Caitlin over there. And what she can do is put your question into Slido. So there is a bit of a disclaimer here, and just like I know everyone in this room thoroughly reads all the disclaimers that we see on our smartphones, I have been asked in my notes that everyone take a very quick read of that wonderful disclaimer there. Put your hand up if you're done. Thank you. Okay, so this is a little bit more comfortable, and welcome everyone on the panel here. I think we're going to start with a pretty general discussion. I think we're really fortunate to have a lot of big thinkers sitting up here on stage tonight, and I guess the first question I'd like to ask is, thinking big picture in terms of the future of urban mobility. How do you see transportation evolving over the next 25 years, and how is that going to impact a region like Metro Vancouver? So maybe Robin, if you could take the lead on that question.
As was said, here this works. So we are in the middle, I think of shifting tectonic plates in the mobility transportation sector, that every single thing is in flux. And we have, 5 to 10 years in which it's going to restabilize in some new shape. So we're seeing the rise of all this tech-enabled disruption, and I would start with how smartphones have really transformed how we can share. So car sharing is much more simple, one-way car sharing is more simple. The ability to have, amazingly, taxis, and so many people using taxis that we can back into urban ride sharing, which is a phenomenon I never thought I could imagine happening. And then the rise of transit apps. I want to say open data has really transformed our access to and be able to use mass transit in a much simpler way. And then the ultimate next thing coming is the rise of autonomous vehicles. And I can say a few sentences more about that. What's been really striking me about self-driving cars is, one, it's happening really soon. I think in the next 4 weeks, you'll be seeing Google's Waymo company putting cars into San Francisco, so not Phoenix, in San Francisco streets with no one in the front seat at all. So it's going to be navigating pedestrians, cyclists, downtown congestion, people pulling out into the street, all of those things. So it's really right around the corner. And what's very interesting to me about self-driving cars is if we think about everything you hate about transportation now, just think of all the things. So I would say air pollution, congestion, vying for curbs, too cheap parking, inadequately priced infrastructure tax, all this underpricing. Autonomous vehicles are taking out the single most expensive thing that in a car, which is your personal time or a driver's time. So what was cheap before, and our decision mechanism for should I take a car or not, is about to plummet even further. So I was just at a research conference in San Francisco 2 days ago, and a researcher was showing that if it was an electric autonomous vehicle, which one would hope it would be, the marginal cost to move it would be $0.01 a kilometer. So I just want you to put in your mind, right now when people say, should I take the car? It's, oh yeah, the cost of gas, maybe some parking, maybe a toll, and my body. Now I can move this car for $0.01 a kilometer wherever I want. So it's a terrifying thing, and that's happening soon. So when I look at this discussion, I just want to impress upon you, we really, really, really need to change the economics of driving before they hit the streets. And so we have never, ever wanted to touch difficult things like congestion pricing. We've never wanted to touch the real cost of pollution. We've never wanted to touch the real cost of parking. When you have self-driving cars with a totally different economic basis thrown into that mix, it's a terrifying world for me. But we could also talk about the upside. I think the upside is we can transform cities in a spectacular way if we get a handle on this. So I see a really great upside, but we're talking downside today.
Well, let's maybe hopefully avoid the terrifying world, but I think it's important that we understand the context in which that could occur. Brent, do you want to jump in on this question?
Well, in an un-Canadian way, I might start off by disagreeing with a few things. Not on the terrifying part. I agree with that word. I've spent a lot of the last few years sitting on panels with some of the smartest people involved in the tech around driverless cars, who I've learned a lot from. And I'm skeptical that it is right around the corner. The kind of narrative I'm hearing from the folks trying to figure out the actual algorithms associated with it, even if you don't do AI, which has its own ethical and sci-fi kind of implications to it, they're significant. You know, there was just another story that said automated cars can't perceive and understand cyclists and bikes. And that's even before you factor in things like the snowfall we just had in Vancouver. So will there be driverless cars on our roads very quickly? Absolutely. Will it still take decades for the fleet, the urban fleet, to turn over, where the driverless car is ubiquitous? It's still decades away. And the challenges associated with that technology from the folks who are actually trying to figure it out, I think, sound pretty daunting to me. But where I agree is that whether it's tomorrow or 20 years from now, planners, who are supposed to be long-term in city halls, need to get a handle on how to upfront manage this and answer the big questions like, will driverless cars be associated with car share and ride sharing, or will it be individual ownership driverless cars? Questions like that are the most important questions in this conversation, because they will determine whether or not driverless cars do great damage to cities or potentially some benefit to cities. But we don't seem to be having any conversation that's about regulation, that's about government getting out in front and trying to influence decisions, private sector decisions, like whether it's fleet versus individual ownership. And that is terrifying to me, because those are the questions that are going to determine success or failure. Can I say, though, as an urbanist, I'm always concerned when we spend most of our time talking about the latest app or the latest tech, when our cities are still struggling to get right the fundamentals of city building and region building. If we want to talk about the future of mobility in our region and other regions, our first conversation should be about land use, and whether land use is facilitating the kind of mobility we actually need, walking, biking, and public transit, being viable, which is largely driven, no pun intended, by land use decisions that we continue to still get at least often wrong. Facilitating much more investment in infrastructure that is multimodal, so we can have multimodal cities, multimodal regions, multimodal citizens, multimodal trips where we can be literally mixing in walking, biking, public transit, and yes, car, presumably, hopefully more car share than individual ownership. So getting the land use right, getting the multimodal infrastructure right, and then making sure that you don't screw up your city accommodating new tech like driverless cars. The example being the things that the programmers will want us to do in the design of our public realm in order to make their cars work better, like fences to prevent pedestrians from sticking out their foot. You know, it's coming. All of the asks from the tech people, oh, automated cars will work fine as long as you just redesign your public realm to take away all the variables that we can't solve in our programming. You know, so getting out in front of that and making sure that, frankly, we don't screw up our cities to accommodate the new tech, like we've done many times in the last 100 years. I think all of that needs to be part of the conversation. But it's too easy for us to think about the latest tech or the latest thing that Elon Musk said and get away and be distracted from the fundamentals of smart mobility and smart city making at the city and regional level.
No, thank you. Well, I often have to point out to my council that they actually are in agreement when they don't necessarily see that face to face. But I really think actually the comments from both Robin and Brent are really actually well connected and aligned. So Robin and Brent have kind of provided a bit of an urbanist perspective to that. But I think maybe to have a look at kind of more an economic look at the future of transportation, I'd like to bring Joy and Marc into the conversation. Maybe Joy, you can start.
One of the aspects of the Mobility Pricing Independent Commission is to look at the economics of how we pay for our transportation, both public and road transportation. Is it fair? Is it equitable? What's the money going to be used for? And is there any way that we can price, as Robin talks about, so that congestion is reduced? Those are the three areas that the Mobility Pricing Commission is looking at. And it's surprising how frequently the discussion does go to what are the economics of who's going to pay, and how are we going to pay, and why do I have to pay? And it's a very interesting debate when we talk to people and say, well, you're already paying for use of certain modes of transportation. Transit fares. People who are in cars never, ever, or very rarely think about the fact that people who take a bus or a SkyTrain are already pricing for the use of their transportation, are paying a price for it. It's controversial, the economic aspect of this. Politicians are reluctant, present company excluded, to address the issue of how we're going to pay for future transportation infrastructure, whether it be technologically based or whether it be a redesign to make other modes of transportation succeed. And it's the single most controversial aspect of the work that we're doing, because everybody wants to reduce congestion. Everybody wants to. And everybody wants it to be, the money to be reinvested in public transit or transportation. But it's the middle part of where it comes from that's controversial.
Thanks, Joy. Marc, maybe I'll let you jump in.
Sure. Well, I mean, I don't think I have a better crystal ball than either Robin or Brent do. I mean, my own experience is I live in East Vancouver. I bike to work most of the time. I take transit several times a week. When my wife got into a car accident 5 years ago, our car was totaled and we didn't replace it. But because of car share, we were able to essentially go out without a car. When we do need the services of a vehicle because it's at certain locations that you're going or certain times, or because you're getting groceries, that option is there. And we walk as well in terms of getting to the local commercial drive or going to the park. So I mean, I think that idea of being multimodal is the key. And I think when I look at the region as a whole, we're getting more people here, thousands of people coming essentially, every week. Planners talking about trying to accommodate 1 million people over the next, 20 years or so. If we have the same proportion of cars that come as the number so that's another 700,000 cars, and we simply just don't have the road space for them, even if they're autonomous and electric and all those other desirable attributes. We have a finite amount of space, and we have a very limited capacity to expand the roads or bridges that we do have. So, fundamentally, we need to be thinking about how are we going to move 3 to 4 million people around this region in a way that's highly efficient. So I think ultimately a lot of this comes down to public transit. We need to build out the mayor's plan, but we probably need to think about mayor's plan plus to get ahead of the curve and really build the backbone infrastructure that's going to move lots of numbers of people fairly quickly. I think to me it's a bit of an illusion to think that everyone's simply going to be able to just Uber around all of the time. And that we can get into this more and more, of course, but I think one of the interesting things that comes up in that discussion as well that people don't talk about as much is fundamentally the transit system public or is it private? Uber Uber has a bad reputation for a lot of reasons, but one of the ones that doesn't get talked about enough is that basically 20% of every ride just flows right out of the city and lands somewhere in San Francisco to the pockets of investors. So do we want a transportation system that is dominated by a small handful of private interests, or do we want one that is much more publicly controlled or cooperatively controlled, like some of the car co-ops are?
Well, wonderful introduction to our discussion this evening. So when I first found out that we had been able to get Robin Chase as our keynote speaker for today's event, I initially thought, wow, we've got the person behind the YouTube video, the Heaven and Hell in terms of future and technology, and I didn't even realize that she's also the founder of Zipcar there. Now, in that video, you talk about a hell scenario where innovations in technology for transportation actually undermine public transit and actually can lead to a future that has more congestion and really has a negative impact on our urban environments. And I guess I wanted to ask you, how do we avoid that path, and how do we make sure that public transit doesn't get undermined through these discussions, and why should we want to avoid that path?
Some of the things that I want to say, I've agreed with 80% of what you said, and just this, I feel like the last 100 years we have spent making personal car ownership incredibly simple and easy, and everything has been around that. And if we changed our mode, our way of thinking for all of this to say, how do we maximize shared and active modes? If we did shared and active modes with the same desire that we made personal car ownership, I think that would be directionally the place we need to be going. So, and there's one more point I want to say, that when we move from personal car, where I'm just thinking about the marginal cost, to when I'm buying a shared trip, I'm now, in theory, paying the full cost. So it's a very nice mental transition from marginal to full costs. I keep coming back to pricing. Just that pricing is the glue that, because we have done such a poor job making this other regime of personal cars, parking is cheap, every house comes with a parking space, and you just made really good points. We don't have the space for that. And so we really need to rethink how we allocate our road infrastructure, and it just keeps coming back to pricing. I mean, we to address the problems we have today and to inoculate ourselves against this future, we need to touch this piece that we have spent 100 years going in the wrong direction. So there's congestion pricing, and there's also congestion management in terms of lane and allocation of space on streets. And that's where transit has done a great job. I just keep going to that same nasty point which is what you guys were talking about.
Well, I think a big part tonight is how do we link the discussion about about changes in transportation with this question about how we fund and raise funds and price transportation, and that could be quite a bit different. Joy, did you want to jump in on?
One of the major themes that we're hearing in our public discussions is around the issue of we don't have any alternatives. You're going to price us for using our car, and yet you're not going to provide us with public transit or any alternative. And if I live in Langley, I can't walk to the store the same way that I can in East Vancouver. That's what we're hearing. And I think it is incumbent upon big public thinkers and decision makers to put the emphasis on providing increased public transit first before people are being asked to pay more for the use of their roads. And I think that can be done. Marc refers to the 10-year vision plus. Is that what you called it, Marc? You said 10-year vision plus? I say plus plus. At least, public transit, as soon as it's built in our region, becomes almost maxed out in ridership. So we're users of public transit, and but there's a need to be much bolder in the vision for providing public transit, because people simply will not abide by increased payments on the roads if they don't have alternatives.
Yeah, well, I certainly, as a strong advocate for public transit, would support that comment. But I think we also need to recognize not all land uses are conducive to high levels of public transit. And maybe I'll go to Brent. How do you deal with situations that, the reality is low density, more spread out areas aren't necessarily conducive to highly efficient public transit? What is the opportunity with new pricing systems and potentially new technologies to connect that to the discussion?
I'm not sure if it's pricing. Well, it is pricing systems. You're right, but it's revealing. Have all of you read "Perverse Cities" by my friend Pamela Blay? She talks about all the costs and consequences that we built into our decisions that appear invisible, and then we say, well, where's the fairness? And why aren't people taking transit more? Because we are subsidizing the wrong things. We're not just subsidizing car driving, we're subsidizing sprawl. And if the costs were revealed and built into not only the decision making, but in the conversations, but talk about political difficulty. If you think it's hard to have a conversation with politicians about cars versus bikes or transit, try density in the suburbs. The conversation about the costs of low density, spread out housing, not just in terms of transportation, but in terms of infrastructure, in terms of everything, is staggering. And yet politicians don't want to have that conversation, I find invariably, particularly in the suburbs. And I work for a lot of cities around the world that are struggling to have that conversation in a more truthful, honest, and sort of transparent way. But it's not easy. And one of the things I always say when I'm trying to prepare my clients for the hard road ahead is, if you're looking for a way to do all the right things that we desperately need done, but you're looking for them in a way that's politically easy and non-controversial, I can't help you, because I haven't seen that yet. What we all have to grow is, frankly, bigger balls and the ability to be able to tell the truth out there about the costs and consequences of the decisions we've been making and the decisions ahead. But as soon as we talk about something like congestion pricing, the immediate conversation is about fairness. And I know we're going to talk about that more in a minute, but I always say, well, if we had an honest conversation about the consequences of not doing it right, where's the fairness in continuing to do it wrong? Where's the fairness to future generations? Where's the fairness to the planet? Where's the fairness to our urban health in the form of increased rates of obesity and preventable diseases and such? We tend to have a very small conversation about fairness. And what we need to have is a much larger conversation, honest conversation about costs and not just pricing, but costs and consequences. And then by all means, let's have a conversation about fairness, but let's have the real one that really embraces all the fairness, including fairness to the future.
No, well, good answer. And I think what you're really getting to is almost some leadership and political courage to be able to be upfront about the challenges that we're facing. Now, the Independent Commission on Mobility Pricing has been working for a year, and I've been certainly hearing feedback from the public. And one common theme that often comes up, whether you're listening to CKNW or other sources, is this is just another tax grab, another attempt to get funding. Maybe, Marc, I'll start with you. Why, beyond just raising revenue, why else should we be looking at a concept like mobility pricing?
Well, I think ultimately the people are going to have to decide. They either are going to pay by staying in long queues to cross bridges or get through key parts of the city, or they're going to choose to pay in order to alleviate that congestion. I think I totally agree with Joy that we need to build out public transit first, and that the revenues that do come from mobility pricing, a lot of them should flow into transit, and some of them can flow to compensate low-income households. I think that's how you deal with the main fairness issue. But we'll come back to that. I think there's a perception among drivers that they are subsidizing everybody else. So, we know that for public transit, it's clearly subsidized. About half of the cost is what you pay in transit fares, and the other is a public subsidy. Drivers, I think, seem to think that, well, then, therefore, I'm subsidizing that. And if you actually look at the numbers more broadly, that's not the case at all. Drivers are not paying anywhere close to the full costs of their ride. There are the public costs associated with infrastructure, of subsidies we provide to the upstreams, oil and gas industry. And on top of that, there are all kinds of costs that we pay in terms of like external costs, carbon emissions being a top one, other forms of air pollution, noise. So when you add all of those together, there are huge costs that are imposed, and some of those, in terms of the costs of accidents, are partially covered by the fees that drivers pay for auto insurance, and it is expensive to own a car, without a doubt. That's why if you can manage to get rid of a car, you're going to save thousands of dollars per year. But I think most of those costs anyways are private costs. So the cost of buying the car, the cost of filling up your tank, the cost of buying insurance, and I think there's a neglect of the overall scheme of how the costs and benefit profiles play out, and they're very different for public transit relative to private cars. So just some broader understanding of that issue and how that plays into it. We have both user fees and we have public subsidies that apply to both driving and transit. And I don't think it's actually that difficult to have a pricing system for mobility pricing that addresses congestion and to do it in a way that's fair. I mean, it's very similar to the discourse we've had on carbon pricing in British Columbia, going back to the carbon tax being introduced almost 10 years ago. Very unpopular when it was first introduced, but now has a fairly decent amount of support. And initially the idea was that it would be revenue neutral, so that you'd have all these tax cuts to offset that. I think in terms of public opinion, people never really got that. They never really understood revenue neutral. But I think they understood the intuition behind why we need to have a carbon price in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, we brought in a low-income credit, which I think has been somewhat successful. It has eroded relative to the size of the tax, and we can get into all that. But I think basically that has worked. And now with the new provincial government, they've abandoned that idea of revenue neutrality and said, look, we need to use this money and plow that back into things that are going to be improving the situation, investing in buildings and investing in transit and this sort of thing with the incremental revenue. So I think that's the type of framework that we need to have for mobility pricing. And if you do that, then you can have a system that's ultimately going to be fair. There are always going to be winners and losers with any kind of policy change, and you want to understand that. And I think in particular, we're concerned about, kind of a stereotypical low-income household who has no other option but to, pay this price, and that they're adversely harmed by this. But there are ways that we can work around those and make it fair and beneficial to everyone.
Well, thank you. So, Joy, you're the vice chair of the Independent Commission on Mobility Pricing. How when questioned on the tax grab type of approach to the question, how do you approach the benefits beyond just raising revenue with mobility pricing?
We try to have a discussion with people to have everybody acknowledge that there are forms of payment right now. People are paying taxes that go into our roads and public transit, just as Marc has outlined. And it's surprising how few people understand exactly what Marc has just outlined, what's already occurring. For instance, the vast majority were unaware initially about the percentage of the gas tax that goes, I think it's 17 cents a liter, that goes to public transit, to TransLink, for payment for our public transit services. So we try to have a discussion about, well, what if we could reduce the cost that you're now paying and make it fairer, make more people who aren't paying anything toward our transportation costs pay a little more. That will help in changing people's behavior to reduce congestion. What if we did that? And the discussion actually takes on a much calmer approach when you're talking about reallocating sources rather than just increasing sources.
Okay, Robin or Brent, want to jump into this one?
Does it help the politics if it's characterized as a user fee? Because that's what it is. Well, depending on the approach to implementation, that's certainly what it could be. Because like transit, like other things, like your energy bill, like whether you turn the light on or not, if you know that you're using it, if you know that you're being charged it based on your usage, then it is a different category than a tax. And usually we have conversations about taxation versus user fees in the context of the overall revenue generation. I personally welcome anything that takes this discourse out of the conversation of revenue. Because I can list you 10 reasons why we should have a carbon tax without even mentioning the word revenue. This is smart policy. This is using your levers, including your financial levers, to achieve public interest goals. And whether that's climate change, pollution, public health epidemics, affordability, sociability, good use of infrastructure, good use of land, you can go down a very long list and talk about how congestion pricing not only is a key tool, in some cases like solving congestion, it's the only tool that works. We actually know that providing even more public transit does not reduce congestion, because you actually need congestion to a certain extent to drive people, no pun intended, towards public transit. So a large number of public interest objectives that should be the basis for the conversation of a carbon tax or a pricing mechanism. And if you can say that it's revenue neutral to stop it from being a conversation about revenue generation, whatever the technique is, as a policymaker, I say use that technique, because then you can get to the truth, which is that there is a great deal of public interest, a great deal of good policy wrapped into a tool and a mechanism like this. And we're being distracted by the conversation about revenue.
Well, another critique, and it has come up in this conversation already regarding mobility pricing, regards to fairness and equity, and that could also, that could be regional fairness in terms of some parts of the region may end up paying more than other parts of the region. It also could be, social fairness in that, it could disproportionately affect lower income earners in the region. And I'd like to throw it out to the panel. How does this concept, which has certainly some opportunities to help our transportation, how do we help mitigate some of those inequities that are just bound to be caused by a mobility pricing system? And maybe Joy, I'll put you on the hot seat on that one.
And that is a major premise of our mandate, is to ensure fairness. What I have learned is that everybody has a big there are a great deal of differences amongst people and regions about what fairness is. For instance, if you have to cross a bridge, you have a very different point of view of what fairness is in eliminating or reducing congestion. If you're now paying in a gas-guzzling car, that's 17 cents per liter to travel from Langley, you do think you're paying your fair share, and of course we know you're not, but you believe that you are. I think it's an area that requires more study than we have done to date. I think it's one of the areas that the Commission will recommend to research after we make our report in April, because of the not only socioeconomic differences in point of view about fairness, but also the regional geographic differences as well. The issue of land use and planning that you talk about, Todd, is coming up regularly when people say, the only place I can afford to live is 30 kilometers from the center of town from my job. That's, the statistics don't necessarily bear that out completely, but it's the perception that people have about the fact that I had to go so far only to get a roof over the head for my family. So the affordability factor of housing and where the jobs are locating are factoring in greatly into what people determine as fair.
Thank you. Well, Marc, I know you've done a lot of work on social inequities and these types of policies. How do you think mobility pricing should be approached to address that end of it?
Yeah, I mean, my starting point is I think that mobility pricing makes a lot of sense because it's the only real tool that you have that's going to be able to address congestion at the key choke points. I mean, the only alternative would be like some kind of like what Singapore did in like the 1970s, like some people, if you have an even numbered license plate, you can drive on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and an odd number license plate, you can drive on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. I mean, that's simply not going to work. I mean, so really the pricing mechanism is the way in which society, in a market-based society like Canada's, how we ration scarce resources. And road space is now a scarce resource with 2.5 million people in the region and a lot more to come. So then the question becomes, how can you design the system in a way that mitigates the challenges for low-income households and for the fact that there are lots of other people who just simply can't drive because of they're too young or they're too old because they have physical disabilities. So it's not just about low income. So how you design the system in terms of time of day and exemptions, there are a whole bunch of ways that you can think about that. And then the other piece is what you do with the revenues. And so my sense is that you need to take a two-pronged approach with the revenues. Part of the revenues, maybe a third or so, I would plow into some kind of credit that would go into low-income households. So you're directly addressing this challenge of low-income households who, because of the hours that they work and where they work, they need to have they need to pay that price, so that they're not necessarily out of pocket, but still everyone on the margin is still facing that charge. And then the other part is to build out public transit, so much more high efficiency modes so that people have alternatives. And I think somewhat because the whole point of mobility pricing is that you're pricing some people off of roads and bridges at key times, you need a certain amount of expansion of public transit just to accommodate that increase. But ultimately, as the population grows, we want to get ahead of the curve in those kind of ways as well. But I mean, I also, in doing research on this, I spent a lot of time looking at data from the recent census that came out in the fall. And when you look at these factors of where low income is in the region and income levels and commuting patterns, like how much time people spend commuting and how far they travel, I mean, it's very heterogeneous. I mean, there are 2.5 million stories of how people get around in the city, and it's really hard to make blanket generalizations about that. So you have to acknowledge that there will be winners and losers in how you move forward, and you just try to be smart about how you design policy, how you design the mobility pricing instrument. And right now, I mean, there's people saw in the hall, there's 7 different flavors of what that could conceivably look like, and the other big part is the revenue side.
Well, wonderful. Well, I see a lot of really good questions come up, so I am going to move over to Slido now. The first question I want to ask, and maybe I'll direct it towards Robin, is what city or region around the world has actually got this right from your experience, and why isn't it being replicated throughout the world?
Is there a city that's got it right? Any place? We always talk about Singapore, where there are huge charges, because just thinking about this idea of how much space do you have, I think they were looking at their land mass, and 22% of land mass is dedicated to roads. So you really have to make efficient use of those roads, just directionally. I think about the city of Paris as being an incredibly great example of hyper multimodal. They don't have a congestion charge, but they are increasingly squeezing out the space for personal cars. And it's been hugely controversial. And the recent data, there were freeways along the Seine on both sides, and then 6 years ago they took out one side, and they recently took out the other side. And the people who lived in the outskirts, who said we aren't well served, were hysterical, that they had no other choices. And they just recently released data, and I want to say that the naysayers say that came out of the city of Paris, and maybe it's not true, but they said that traffic evaporated and that the cars, that 18% of cars that was going along the Seine it did not go into the upper ones. It did not go through the neighborhoods. The people just took alternate routes. Just one piece around technology I wanted to add to this conversation was when we think about how do we, in addition to building out mass transit for alternatives on these roads, I'm really struck by how the future of the app-based ride-sharing is doing something that I can make urban matched rides on the fly if enough people participate is a new tool that didn't exist before. So now you could make, in theory, an urban carpool that actually worked, whereas before it's never worked before, and it's failed and failed and failed and failed. But it is appearing now in some of the cities in which those DNCs have been long enough operating that enough people are putting in their origin and destination and time that they are able to get more people in there. So I feel like there's this inkling of there's a potentiality that if you wanted to get into that congestion pricing lane, today you could get yourself in there by sharing a trip that didn't used to exist before. So just throwing out there's a new tool in the toolbox that actually is working.
Okay, well, it might explain why this is so difficult in that it really probably hasn't been mastered perfectly in any part of the world, and that might answer the second part, why it hasn't been replicated. This next question really has, Brent, yeah?
It depends on what your definition of success is. If you say doing it well, is there a city that has done something and car traffic has evaporated? No, because there will always be congestion. If you understand induced demand and the law of congestion, you will have congestion. So the definition of success is not to suddenly have empty roads. The only city I've worked in that has empty roads is Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I worked last year, and you can shoot a cannon down the roads. They've made them so wide because they literally tore down all the things worth going to. In their zeal of building more roads and more parking.
So that's not the recommended solution,
That's not
is it?
success.
No.
So the cities that are succeeding are not the ones without congestion. The cities that are succeeding are the ones that are providing the other alternatives, where congestion is motivating people to change where they live relative to where they work and change their mobility choices, like taking public transit, like walking and biking within their neighborhood. So the cities that are succeeding are those cities. And I'd like to point out that Vancouver is a success story in the context of how we've been building for the last number of years. The challenge is we are both a success story and increasingly now a cautionary tale because we're not keeping up. We're not continuing the success that we have been having over the last number of generations, and now we're starting to we're already facing the consequences, and we'll do so more into the future.
Thank you. So this next question has joy written all over it. Does ICBC have a role to play in mobility pricing? Insurance by the mile companies in the U.S. are collecting real-time data through their in-vehicle monitoring. Could that technology be potentially one of the outcomes of the Mobility Pricing Commission?
It was so funny when I was asked to chair ICBC. I had no idea that the two assignments that I have as the vice chair of the commission and an ICBC would actually converge. Because yes, there's a huge relationship between what we all pay for our insurance and congestion. 40% of car crashes occur on congested roads and at points of the times of high congestion. So the pressure on our insurance rates are directly related to any solutions we may find to reducing congestion. And we always say reduce congestion because your point is well taken. It will never be eliminated. And really it's a small percentage of people that we need to have them change their behavior when we can actually make our have a good effect and proper effect on managing congestion. ICBC is looking at the way we will charge people for insurance, not just the product that you get for insurance, but the way we are actually going to charge you. And it's been decades, let me put it that way. It's been decades since the corporation looked at modernizing the way that people are charged for insurance. If you live in an area where you have access to lots of public transit and you rarely use your car, you don't get any break for that. You don't get any break for where you travel. Sometimes you get a break for why you travel. If you're on, well, it's actually not a break, you pay more if you have business insurance. But we are looking at all of those ways of modernizing the way people pay for insurance, the same way that other jurisdictions have already done. And I'll just say, I'll make a plug here, public service plug, that later this month we'll be starting a public consultation on exactly these issues, including distance-based insurance, and I hope everybody participates.
No, well, I think the mayor's had a lot of foresight to appoint you to the Mobility Pricing Commission 6 months before you also joined the ICBC board. I think we might have lucked out in that regard. This next question's interesting because it actually kind of goes contrary to how sometimes people think about mobility pricing in a negative context when it comes to affordability. But this question is, how can we use mobility pricing to actually improve and address affordability in our region? Who wants to take a stab at that one? Don't all jump up at once. Brent.
The right way to think about affordability, is this on? The right way to think about affordability is to think about affordable living, not affordable housing, and particularly not affordable home ownership, which is the way we tend to characterize affordability. So when you think about affordability, you're thinking about how much it costs for your home, including if you rent, what your energy costs are, and then the transportation piece, which doesn't get enough attention, whether you need to own 1, 2, or 3 cars, whether you need to own any cars, whether there's car share available, and all the other modes we've been talking about. But then there's the other side of affordability, which is there job space nearby? And for high-paying jobs, or are you a community that increasingly has lower and lower income levels? So when you think about affordability in that context, the broad affordable living context, looking at both costs and revenue in the form of salaries, then I think this kind of pricing mechanism can play a role in that. Because especially if you're doing a tax balancing or revenue neutral, I think you use a pricing mechanism like congestion charging to get people to rethink their travel patterns and thus lower their own costs. And if it's offset by a reduction in taxes somewhere else, then their actual affordability can improve. Plus, we also know that if you're putting more land use and such on transit and in walkable, bikeable communities, then increasing density and reducing housing size, then you can actually address affordability in the terms of housing costs, the costs of stuff, as I call it, all the stuff you fill your too large house with, and transportation and energy costs, etc. So if you look at it in that broad sense, I think this can play a role. But if you just focus on the way we tend to talk about affordability, which is how much it costs to buy my home, then it's hard to think about how this fits.
Yeah. Marc, did you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think I alluded to this before, but I mean, if you can, as a household, give up a car, either go car free or go from 2 cars to 1 car. It costs something like $6,000 to $8,000 per year. When you look at amortization, insurance, and fuel, more. I guess I'm a low end sort of. I don't go for the high end stuff. So, the potential savings are huge. So, for our household, getting rid of a car, we've saved thousands of dollars per year. But when we do need the services of a vehicle, because we're going to IKEA or something like that, using car share is a really great alternative, and then of course there's increased use in transit and ideally increased use in walking and biking. But that comes back to some of the stuff Brent was getting at the outset, which is around design. Like the point is not to replace long trips in a car with equally long trips by bus. The point is to have people living closer to where they work and shop and play, so that those options are more available, and it's about people being able to have choice in the moment about which particular mode they're going to be taking because of the particular requirements they have and what the weather's like, and a whole bunch of other things that are going to be part of their decision-making set.
Thank you. Robin?
I was asked a couple months ago if I could do one survey question over time. What would that question be? And do you need a car to get to work? And let's track that over time and have it diminish. Because if you need a car to get to work, you're going to own that car, and when you own that car, you're going to use that car. And so I don't need a car because I did great land use planning. I don't need a car because we expanded bike lanes and whatever, I feel safer. I don't need a car because we made the mix of work and we made dense mixed use places. But that question, dude, so we think about equity. I used to say that, so when the government builds a highway, it's a contract to say, okay, we did our part, now you have to spend $9,000 a year. Like, that's an incredible contract. When we build transit, and now you're going to take these bite-sized pieces of $2.50 a trip. So it's a very different kind of contract, but do you need a car to get to work? And to your point, all these other costs associate.
No, thank you. So, I think I can safely say that, the mayors are a little bit nervous in terms of what the Mobility Pricing Committee are going to come up with their final report. And, we're also in the context of a new provincial government who got elected, and one of their first actions was to remove tolls on two of the bridges. How optimistic are the people up here that we're actually going to be able to take the report from the Mobility Pricing Committee and actually see that lead into public policy change? And maybe I'm going to give Joy the first opportunity to...
I'm 100% optimistic. Anything less and I'll come and track you down, Jonathan. We are trying very much to make our report, and I think we will be successful at this, at being very user-friendly by politicians. And when and I don't in any way mean to disparage politicians, because I was speaking from personal experience when I know how difficult it is to implement major change as an elected person. It's balancing your constituents' interests with good public policy is the most difficult aspect of elected officials' jobs. The report will be principle-based. We're not going to in any way be descriptive in saying you must charge this amount during this hour on this day by any stretch of the imagination. And if you've actually seen the scenarios we've outlined on our website, itstimemv.ca, you'll see that the scenarios are based on what are probably real-life situations for 5 or 6 people under different circumstances. And those scenarios will guide us to reach a set of principles, but we'll talk about principles that the politician should use in guiding good public policy. I think we'll also come to the conclusion that more work needs to be done in the area of research, that the topic is huge, but there are answers there, but more thoughtful research has to be done in certain areas.
Well, I think if our premier does get some cold feet, I might send you over to Victoria, Joy, to do some advocating. But appreciate that a very optimistic view about that. But I'd like to hear from particularly Brent and Marc, who are aware of kind of the local circumstances. How optimistic are you, both in short term and maybe long term, of us being able to move forward with this? And are there ways we can help, whether it's political leaders, navigate ourselves to an endpoint where we kind of agree we need to go to?
Mobility pricing, congestion pricing, decongestion pricing, whatever you choose to call it, is smart policy, and it's the right thing to do. And if I had confidence that being right was enough these days, I would be optimistic. But we all know that being right or factual or scientific isn't nearly enough these days. You have to be persuasive. I hope the recommendations are bold. And to a certain extent, because I've seen too many reports sit on shelves collecting dust, when there isn't a political push and pathway to do the right thing. My perspective, and certainly in my practice, what I say is it's my job to convince leaders and decision makers to do the right thing, and it's my job to make them look smart in doing so and showing them a path to success in doing so. If I just tell them the right thing to do and then be mad at them for not doing it, then I'm lazy. My job is to paint them in a corner to a certain extent, make it hard for them to not do the right thing because, it's so obvious. And on the other hand, make it easy for them by giving them all the narrative, the messaging, the data, the science, the storytelling to do it successfully. And then it stands a chance of succeeding these days, because being right is just not nearly enough. You need to be incredibly persuasive. So this is being factual, this is marketing, this is messaging, this is persuasiveness and convincing. The politicians and the public and the media and all the naysayers who are going to be attacking whatever the recommendations are, no doubt.
Marc, do you have?
Well, I think the politics are going to be really hard, to be honest. I mean, I think that mobility pricing is totally the right way to go. I think it can be designed in a way that mitigates the concerns we've raised around fairness. I think on the positive side, congestion has gotten bad enough in a lot of parts of the region that people want something to happen. My question is what is the willingness to pay? And until there's an actual proposal on the table that specifies how much it's going to cost to cross that bridge or to enter that particular zone, and then you can almost imagine the Canadian Taxpayers Federation negative campaign starting to percolate out. That's what you're going to have to face. I think bring people from Stockholm here, because I think that's one of the big success stories around congestion charging. They had I think it was in 2006, they had a 6-month pilot. It worked really well, and at the outset it was unpopular. They actually put it to referendum. It passed because it was demonstrated to be successful in doing what it does, and then it's even more successful now. And Stockholm has very similar geography to Vancouver in terms of multiple crossings over water. So I think ultimately the system that's probably going to work best for Vancouver is something like that, probably like tolls on all the bridges and a few other key nodes around the region. So in London, I think it was the same thing. It was kind of unpopular when it first came in, and then once people actually saw the results, it became popular. So if you can just get over that initial hump, then I think you could have a good, durable, sustainable system, but be prepared at the outset to deal with that negative campaign right off the bat. And I would just start by saying, look, I took transit to get here. I paid $3.30 on my Compass card, so why should someone who drove here not have to pay anything?
Well,
A point, that excellent suggestion about Stockholm and London. Is Daniel Firth here? There's Daniel. Daniel is our project director on the commission, and Daniel worked on both the Stockholm initiative and the London initiative. So we are subject to some of the best advice, just as you suggest, Marc. And Daniel is available 24 hours a day to take your input. And we're very fortunate to have that experience. And the experience that you describe is exactly as Daniel would describe it as well.
Robin, did you want to jump in?
Yeah. It is really amazing what did happen in Stockholm and in London. But what strikes me is those were done a decade ago, and that they were built with really heavy infrastructure and cordons, and so it cost, I think it was $300 million to do Stockholm, or $400 million, something around there. And so to do a pilot and say, okay, we're going to do $400 million, we're going to do a pilot, and we'll see what happens. What's striking me today is that technology has transformed, and we don't need to do it in that big, heavy way. And so I just want to lay out a lighter scenario, is that who has a smartphone in this room? Have you ever used Google Maps or Waze or some navigation system? And I would say Uber and Lyft today their entire business model is a charge per distance based on a smartphone in that car. And so today, I think that in a very short order, we could be doing a very fast pilot where you've downloaded an app. You can have a trusted third party. You can have multiple parties do it, so you can have different privacy ways that we could be doing that kind of pilot very, very quickly. And for the people who don't have smartphones, give them a $15 burner phone. They're cheap, and they can do the same piece. So I think we are in a moment where we don't have to do the $400 million investment, that we can do something very fast.
Brent.
I'm curious, and maybe Daniel can comment. I debate with myself about whether it's effective and successful to say, let's learn from Stockholm and London. Because I work all over the world, and I always find I have a hard time referencing any other place wherever I am, because it's but they're different because blah blah woof woof, don't you know? They're flat, they're red, they're cold, they're blue. I don't know. It doesn't matter. There immediately becomes a pushback. And by the way, Stockholm and London are other. They're far away. So I debate I use examples and best practices from other places, but I debate with myself about how effective they actually are, and I'd appreciate maybe if Daniel has a perspective on that. When I'm talking about a need for a really blunt conversation, leading from what you said, there's enough of an interest that people want to solve congestion, but will they pay for it? What I would like is a discourse that says, no more having your cake and eat it too. No more false choices. If you want to solve congestion, this is the only tool that works. And we have to stop doing ourselves a disservice by confusing the message. When the transit referendum was being done, the narrative around that was invest in transit to reduce congestion. And I had to point out, that's wrong. We know that if you actually build more transit, you will move more trips. You will move more people on transit with fewer space and less public cost. But you won't reduce congestion because of the law of congestion and induced demand. The congestion will stay the same. You will move more people. So if you want to have a serious conversation about reducing congestion, you have to pay. And by the way, if you vote because the Tax Federation does its bullshit again, if you vote against it, then stop the conversation with your politicians about reducing congestion. Because you just had the chance to do the one thing that is proven around the world to actually reduce congestion, and you weren't willing to pay individually for it. So no more having your cake and eat it too. I would love that kind of discourse, that honest, true discourse, and having people out there ready to put that out into the narrative and say, you don't get to have your cake and eat it too. This is what it'll take. How bad do you want it?
Don't ever run for public office.
And I will never run for public office. But I'll tell you, I spend a lot of time in the media, and the media is actually looking for that kind of narrative because at least it's true and interesting. And they will report it, and it can change the discourse.
So I have a lot of respect for Brent, but I don't think I'm going to be hiring him as my speechwriter in any upcoming campaign. So this next question, I actually have a bit of challenge with it as someone who really likes to champion good public, genuine public engagement. But the question is, why are we consulting on mobility pricing? If we're all convinced that this is good public policy, why don't we just do it? Who wants to take that one on?
Actually, with respect, Mayor, you should probably answer that question. And I do mean that very respectfully, because you're always been a champion of good public policy. I think what the Mayor's Council and the TransLink Board were thinking when they established our independent commission was that solutions need to be found, as Todd and everyone has advocated up here, that mobility pricing is a solution that's worked elsewhere and that is one that can be considered, but the public is unaware. The public is unaware of the topic. The public is fully aware that congestion harms their lives. When we polled on this, 89% said congestion is a problem. But I don't think ordinary citizens are aware of what solutions are available. It's a good educational exercise. It's a way of having a good debate about what already is occurring, the ways you're already paying, about the inequities, about fairness issues, about having a good discussion around capturing land value. All of this is leading up to making a good decision. I think I always believe that consultation is best before making major change. as you do too.
No,
I know.
I agree. I often fear, a big fear as a moderator when the table gets switched. But I think I could say ditto with the same question. I think when you're talking about complex public policy, you really do need the public to understand the discussion of why we're that. Because in the end, if you want that policy to succeed in the long run, people need to understand it and know why it's been put in place. So the next question, relates to, we've kind of talked about money being raised for sustainable transportation and public transit, but given that, I think there's general consensus that these things are so important to our region, why do we need something like mobility pricing to be able to fund that? Why can't we just, through our other taxation methods, be able to do the right thing and fund things like public transit? So these are anonymous questions, but but I'll let the panel take a stab at that.
Well, I feel like that's a trick question because the answer is obvious. We look at the transit referendum. We had to vote around a new tax, which basically threw transit's funding under the bus by attaching it to an unpopular new tax, when the road projects just get built with the regular budget. And the space allocation starts with the assumption, well, we need all these lanes. Gee, it's a shame we don't have any space left over for bus-only lanes or something like that. So the priorities are what's driving things, not the budget. I've always rejected with my clients the notion that there isn't enough space or there isn't enough money or new funding mechanisms, usually of which are unpopular. And my American clients are masters at this. They will do a referendum or a plebiscite for new funding sources, always for the right things, and yet the wrong things just get funded automatically in their budgets. So when we say a reprioritization, it's a reprioritization of space, reprioritization of initial base budgets, etc. And that's got to happen, or else we're constantly in this game of trying to push a rock uphill, finding the political support or what have you for new unpopular funding sources and such to pay for the things that actually have better public value and public payback associated with it.
Yeah. So I think this next question's a good one for Robin. We've kind of talked about autonomous vehicles, and if they get implemented the same way we use vehicles right now, I think you describe it as a bit of a hell scenario. Can you elaborate on why we might not want to allow privately owned autonomous vehicles, and how does that fit into this whole discussion?
I have to reference something called the Shared Mobility Principles for Livable Cities. You can go to sharedmobilityprinciples.org. And this is where this question is stemming from. These principles were developed by 10 NGOs that work across the world. So what was good for cities and for people who live in them. And there's 10 of them. And they're all kind of motherhood and apple pie if you work in transportation. And then the last one was the kicker, which was autonomous vehicles in dense metro areas should be shared. And previously we said they should be electric up above. And so I've heard a lot of controversy on that particular point, and there's two pieces around this. One, we described how when you have a self-driving car, or any car, you're just thinking of the marginal costs, and the marginal cost of driving something that you don't have to be in is even lower. So we want to take a transition from marginal cost to making you feel the full cost of that trip when you make your trip decision. So that's why you want to go from personal ownership to shared. I also would like to see it happen that way because in dense metropolitan areas, and what is dense is the big question. In dense metro areas, that would be Singapore and Hong Kong and Dakar and Mumbai, and maybe parts of the city of Greater Vancouver are dense. It's unclear. But there's a couple other things. If we think of who are going to be the first owners of autonomous vehicles, it's going to be rich people. And rich people are going to get all the benefits of doing it because they're the ones who can afford it. And if we want to have this as an equity issue, if they're shared, it means I as a poor person can buy a seat in that vehicle and I can get all those benefits too. When they're not shared, the first one's out, it's all rich people. It's going to be another decade till me as a poor person can ever get the benefits of that. I would say there's other reasons around safety and maintenance. Do any of you guys on your laptops or your cell phones have an software update that you haven't updated? So just put that into self-driving cars, and if they were in shared fleets, we would have a maintenance professional whose job it only is to make sure that the LiDAR is washed and it's up, it's there. So I think there's some really good reasons that say, I'd like to say forever, but I could soften the self-driving cars in dense metro areas should be shared to say, for the first 5 years. Let's do the first 5 years and give us time to share the benefits and give us time to envision and experience a world in which shared transport is just so dramatically better than ownership. And again, you can buy a seat or you can buy a whole car, a whole car trip.
Okay, does anyone have anything else to add to that, Brent?
You named a number of benefits for shared versus privately ownership. The other one is congestion itself, because imagine, like, people keep talking about the fact we won't need parking anymore. The only scenario where that may be true is in shared ownership, because shared fleet. If it's privately owned, the only way we won't need parking is if you're literally sending your car home to wait for you and for you to summon it back, which means your one trip, your 2 trips back and forth just became 4 trips. Imagine being stuck in traffic where all the cars around you are empty because they're all being sent someplace else to avoid a parking charge, or because there's a lack of parking in your downtown. The number one reason why you need shared ownership is because any other scenario exponentially expands the number of cars trying to use up the same finite amount of geometry on our roads.
Yes. If I have to pay any amount for that parking when my own self-driving car, what is the cheapest meter? $2 an hour? I'm not going to pay $2 an hour. Go home and spend 4.5 hours in traffic and come back. Right. So there will be, unless you're going to offer me free parking in downtown Vancouver, which I don't see happening soon, I'm sending it to Kingdom Come.
Well, it's an interesting dynamic, because if parking does have a cost, but our roads are free, then I think that dynamics, and that's where you connect these discussions with mobility pricing. I think during this week, the topic of even delivering of goods in retail came up about that, and even talking about companies like Amazon moving away from big warehouses and actually just having their stock in a roving group of trucks just driving around 24/7 to provide immediate deliveries, but also to recognize the roads are free. So why would we pay lease on there? And I think that's an interesting part of this discussion. So we've reached the true and false section of the quiz tonight. So is mobility pricing the great equalizer that ensures we best manage having a livable, progressive city with the ongoing... Oh, I've lost the question. Oncoming of autonomous vehicles. Sorry. It moved around on the screen and I lost it for a second. Is mobility pricing the great equalizer that ensures we best manage having a livable, progressive city with the oncoming of autonomous vehicles?
I can say this in a different way. If we have fair user fees across all modes, yes, true.
True or false?
I think it's a trick question. I say false because there is no one great equalizer. I reject the notion of a silver bullet. We have to do a lot of things well, but one of them is this.
Well, I remember back to my university days and trying to answer true and false questions with a long answer, and it never worked out well for me, but credit to you. So the next question, how does mobility pricing affect commuters who live outside of Metro Vancouver traveling to their workplaces? Maybe, Joy, you want to take a stab at this one?
When we were examining the various points of congestion, and our heat map shows about 8 points of congestion, they weren't all what we may have thought they would be. Everybody traveling from outside of the downtown core into the downtown core. There are points of congestion from people traveling from New Westminster to Burnaby around the metro town. Your point of congestion is around the highway exits or entrances from the highway into New Westminster. The North Shore is a major point of congestion of people trying to travel east-west, not even crossing a bridge. So it's not just about how far you travel, it's about what your trips are for and when you take those trips. And another point would be what people want is some sort of reliability of the time it's going to take. That people have said to us, listen, when I go to pick my kid up at daycare, I want to know it's going to take me 40 minutes, not 50 minutes one day and 20 minutes the next day. That's not good enough. I need to have a reliable time for that journey. So that's part of the congestion. People who live far away and have to travel far to their job have specific interest on making sure that we're finding that those people are less likely to want to have anything that's based on the distance you travel. That they would rather, and that makes sense. Yeah, funny how that works out. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they rule out congestion pricing completely, that putting a cordon around areas of congestion and traveling through that cordon, people are willing to pay. But I will give you one example of how everything's local. We did discuss with one group of politicians about the issue of preps, what if they were going to have congestion points, i.e. tolling on bridges, what would they recommend? And the politicians thought it would be an absolutely fabulous idea to toll every bridge in the region. Oh wait, no, not the one that goes into our community, just every other bridge, please. Everything is local, there's no question about that.
Yeah. Marc, did you want to?
Well, fairness is in the eye of the beholder. If it increases my costs, then it's unfair. So, but I think that is an issue, especially when you look at the outer suburbs. You know, the average commuting distance is higher, and so folks in Maple Ridge are going to, on average, pay more to use their vehicles than someone in New Westminster. But again, that's in a per kilometer pricing system. If it's congestion charge points like tolls on the bridges, then you have a different set of fairness issues. You know, a lot of it's interesting from the census data. Like a lot of people still actually just travel within their own municipality in terms of their commute. We always think of there are these big long distance that everyone's doing, but it's not uniformly that way. So, but if it's crossing a bridge, then someone who lives on one side of the bridge and only has to go to the other side of the bridge is going to get hit. But someone who's just traveling within their zone won't necessarily get charged. So again, it comes down to these choices you make about how we design the pricing system, and that's going to have a different set of winners and losers based on what that formulation looks like. And even across the sort of 7 flavors out on the boards today, the impacts are going to vary. So I mean, I think it would be helpful if the Commission came up with a more specific proposal that actually chose, rather than just kind of laying out the various options and punting it back to the politicians. But that's I know that's a hard one to come to grips with.
Yeah, moving on to the next question, it kind of keys back to the affordability issue, which keeps coming back. I think in our discussion tonight, we've all kind of acknowledged that we've been underinvesting in transportation, particularly public transit in the region, and that even we've been underpaying for it in terms of car drivers and different use of our transportation system, not paying what they need to pay. But how, in the context of what I would call is a bit of an affordability housing crisis in the region and the high cost of housing, which really dominates a lot of discussions, how are we able to connect these two, given how sensitive the region has become on this topic? I think we finally stumped them.
Well, I kind of feel like I gave us an answer to that to the previous question. I'm not sure I would add something new. the conversation about affordability is going to need a whole different kind of commission with a whole different kind of mechanisms, which are already being debated, foreign ownership taxes, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's going to play out in the context of other conversations. But this whole idea that in order to address affordability and our inherent perspective of the kind of housing we need, we can go further and further away to be able to afford a large house. Let's face it, it's not to be able to afford a house, it's to be able to afford a large house. Most of the people I know who've moved out to the suburbs haven't moved out to get affordable housing per se. They've gone out to be able to afford a bigger house for a lesser price. So to a certain extent, it's being driven by our perception of what kind of house we want. Let's be honest about that. But the idea that you can go further and further out and often to have a bigger house, but then expect that your transportation isn't going to have any cost associated with it, and yet all that infrastructure is being provided for you and your commute, that's a bit of a funny expectation that I think needs to be part of the conversation. You know, and in most of the cases when I'm talking to ordinary people in the context of my work, most of the time the context of what people need or hardship or fairness usually often is in the context of stories they tell me about getting their kids to hockey 3 times a week and dance twice a week. And it's always a bit ironic to me that it never occurs to them that all of those lifestyle choices, including the big house they live in out on the outskirts, are choices that don't necessarily need to be subsidized by everyone else in the context of places that ironically pay more taxes and have lesser demand on our infrastructure. So, as I say, by all means, let's have a conversation about fairness, but let's have a real honest one, because there's a lot of inherent subsidization into a lot of our choices.
I just have to say, what you said is completely true, but if you think about sunk costs, I bought that house, and now I'm there.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
and that's interesting because if you apply any kind of a congestion charge, in terms of law of supply and demand, that should theoretically actually reduce prices of houses on the outskirts, because now you've increased the overall operating cost of a home purchase. But that doesn't help the people who've already paid the price. And that only happens if the market actually recalibrates to assume that cost into what people are willing to pay.
Just sitting here now and thinking about how technology has changed, I'm just going to posit a crazy, wild idea. What if you as an individual or you associated with a car could choose whether you wanted to pay the point or the VKT, congestion charge, and you could change your decision once every 6 months? And so, you know what? Technology can do that, like whatever.
Well, and the other thing to that very good point is you can make a system that's incremental. Not everything has to be instituted on day one. So there's all sorts of phase in, right?
Well, I mean, there's also an element of globalization and financialization that's playing out here, and you've seen this become a topic of discussion around the housing market in recent years. External capital influencing the cost of housing in the city and affordability, and some of that it could be mainland China, but it could equally be capital from Ontario or Alberta that's affecting that. So if you think that in transportation, well, what if all of a sudden we just open it up to investors, wherever they may be, owning fleets or individual autonomous cars driving around the city? So I mean, how does that actually start to impact the way we get around and the costs associated with that? So I mean, I think this is the right conversation to be having, right? That we have these pressing transportation challenges now, and how do we address those? Are we going to address those in a more laissez-faire manner, or are we going to try to have good planning based on an understanding of the kind of external costs that flow through this, the role that the public sector can play, or the role that sort of various people, by getting together cooperatively in the more local context, can work to solve those problems themselves?
Robin?
So I like to ask this because I'm an outsider. What is the goal of the congestion pricing, the mobility pricing? Is it that we want to induce more throughput? Is it that we want to raise money for transit? Is it that we want to shape other things? And so I guess...
Yes.
And I think that's been one of the
all
challenges
three.
in the discussion, in that the Mayor's Council did approve this process and said we've got three goals. We want to raise funding to help support public transit. We want to use this as a tool to positively impact congestion, and we want this to be fair and equitable. And I think there is a recognition around the body that those three goals actually aren't always necessarily fully aligned, and in some respects do compete with each other. So it is. We have not given the Commission an easy task to achieve those.
So what if one of them changed? What if we changed our budget priorities so transit was funded automatically and congestion pricing was talked about in the context of being able to afford more roads? And you actually ask people, do you want to have a congestion charge to be able to afford roads? But the transit is assumed. Reversal of our priorities right now. I ask that because, once again, we're doing another version of the transit referendum, where something that might be quite unpopular gets thrown under the bus again in the context of a conversation about how we're going to be able to afford the thing we should be fundamentally budgeting for.
So I'm not sure if this has ever happened, but elections could get in the way of a good public policy, and I'm not sure whose idea it was to have the Commission's report come out 3 months before a municipal election. But how will the 2018 municipal election impact the findings of the Commission?
We noted it with interest, but we're independent from the politicians, and we will report out as in a fashion that's unaffected by the upcoming elections. That's with my official hat on. Personally, I hope it becomes an election topic. I understand there's going to be change at many municipal councils with retirements, people not running again, and there'll be new candidates coming up, and there doesn't have to be an element of ownership amongst new candidates on one position or the other. And so I'm saying all this personally. Probably it's risky to do that, but I hope we want to provide a document that will promote good public discussion toward great public policy, and sometimes an election can be used for that.
Okay. Does anyone else want to help counsel me through the next 4 months? Let's see.
Wait. What was interesting in London was that the Mayor Livingston said he was going to do congestion pricing. So when he got elected, it was a mandate, like done. And so it could be that this is really a perfect timing in that people who are running can express their support, and you choose them, and then you've chosen them because of their support.
Well, and I mean, we've talked about this before. I mean, 89% of Metro Vancouver folks think congestion is a problem. So, do you want to solve congestion or not? I mean, the alternative is you can stay and take an extra 15 or 20 minutes or an hour, because it's funny, we always think about those times when the SkyTrain breaks down. I remember the last one really well because I got stranded downtown a month ago. But I mean, every day there's a stalled car or an accident at some point in the regional network that delays the situation for thousands of people who are traveling to some place, and that seems to never be part of the conversation. So do we want to deal with congestion or not? That's really the question.
In many cases.
Now, I've scrolled down a little bit for the next question because I identified it relates to kids. I've got 3 kids, and I know the challenges in trying to get them from point A to point B. And kids, whether it's car seats or just equipment, sports equipment, have stuff. How does this future world where we're all sharing cars and all going around and hailing autonomous car pods work with all the complications of family life, modern family life? And maybe Robin, if you want to take a stab at this one.
As a mother of 3 children, women are slaves to we are their chauffeurs. And I think if we talk about equity issues, having women who are predominantly, I realize there's a lot of men, and you're doing a lot of driving too. I think women are still doing more driving. So I think about autonomous vehicles, and I can imagine the soccer bus autonomous vehicle that will have its 17-year-old chaperone who will be taking to. So I think it'll be a hugely freeing piece. And a person who is 20 years older than me, grew up in Manhattan, and when he was 6, he would take the bus to school every day and every day back. And we have now organized our lives where we can't even imagine that. And I was taking a bike ride in the Netherlands the other day, and my joy was watching these 14-year-old girls flying down the bike path after school to go get to soccer practice. I thought, wow, that is so phenomenal. And so I'm totally unswayed by the fact that everyone has to have the minivan to carry all their junk in it. Like, there's so many other ways.
Well, my wife is about 20 blocks away at home right now, and I think I could hear her cheering with some of your answer there. So, Brent, do you have?
There are 7,000 children in downtown Vancouver. New West, of course, has put in policies around family-friendly housing that I helped you with. I am about to become a 2-time dad, I guess. My wife is going to be giving birth to our second son in April. People have been asking me, when are you going to buy the car again? Because we went car-free in 2009. Downtown Vancouver has the lowest rate of car ownership anywhere in the region. It's the part of Vancouver that has had the biggest growth in kids. We just opened the second downtown elementary school. I live a half a block away from it. I bought near it. So the whole narrative, and I spend a lot of time working with cities on creating family-friendly urban places. The narrative that you need a minivan, the narrative that you need to give your child the option to be in the dance class on the other side of the region, instead of saying, no, pick something in your neighborhood. These are all self-fulfilling problems, self-fulfilling prophecies that we've created for ourselves. We are an actual global example that you can raise families in highly urban, car-free places. People come to study the Metro Vancouver area, and particularly downtown Vancouver. So we're the proof that that is not right. But the number one word in that conversation is neighborhood. I say that I can exist car-free with 2 kids, not because of my ideology, but because the neighborhood facilitates that for me. I live in a place that it's actually a hassle to own a car in downtown Vancouver. So we need to it goes back to land use. It's about how we design our neighborhoods to facilitate car-free living, whether you're a family, whether you're single, etc.
So we are getting near the end of our discussion, and I'd like to give Joy the last word. I'm wondering if you can give us a bit of a sneak preview on what to expect when the Mobility Pricing Commission has done their work in the next month or two, and I think everyone in this room can help keep a secret, right?
I'm cognizant of what Marc advised, and I take it to heart that it would be great if we could just give the solution. I think that's kind of what you're hinting at, or a couple of options to the solution. We're not going to do that, and because we do want it to remain an active report that can be used by each municipality as they proceed over these coming months and through an election, and in partnership with provincial government. But we will be we won't be wishy-washy, I promise you. I can promise you no wishy-washiness, that we will address the 3 principles, our mandate of the 3 areas of reducing congestion, promoting fairness, and providing revenue for transportation and public transit. There are factors that are arising that are not part of our mandate but need to be addressed. And we will, there are several, and I won't mention them right now, but we will highlight those areas that have been of public concern that are outside of our mandate. We will highlight them and suggest to the politicians that these areas of concern by the public need further investigation, further research, and further public policy development. We're going to give guidelines to the politicians about how to develop a policy that promotes all three aspects of our mandate. You are right that there's cross pressure between the three goals, and we will address that as well. It's going to be readable, totally readable, I promise.
Well, I think everyone in this room can't wait to get the report when it's finally released. So I want to thank the panel here for this really engaging discussions, and maybe if we can give a warm thank you to the panelists here. And I'd like to also give a warm thank you to each and every one of you in the room here. To me, genuine public engagement is an important way we can move forward with complex public policy. And your engagement and participation in tonight's discussion, I think, is absolutely a critical part in being able to move forward. So, I think from the panel to you, thank you so much for coming out here this evening. So that concludes the formal portion of the event. I'm now going to go get autographs and selfies with these guys, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.